I've been living in Mexico, specifically Mexico City, for nearly 4 years. And prior to moving here, I always wanted to establish residency in more than one country. Because if we learned one thing from the pandemic and the subsequent border shutdown, is it's always good to have options. As many of you know, I was recently in Lisbon, Portugal, and Portugal was still on my list as possible locations for second residency. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. But before we get into whether or not Portugal and I were a match and I'll be moving there, let me introduce myself in case you are new here. My name is Adelia Borishade, although most people on the internet know me as Picky Girl Travels the World. I am a financial educator and relocation specialist. My jam is helping Black women take control of their finances so that they can travel or move abroad or do whatever it is that makes them happy. So on this channel, we talk about living outside the US, we talk about travel, we talk about money. If any of those are topics of interest to you, be sure to subscribe and then ring the notification bell. That way, you'll be the first to know the next time I upload a video. This trip to Portugal, which was just last week, I still have the jet lag from it. This was not my first time visiting Portugal or Lisbon. Right during my time when I lived in Honduras, which was 2016, I spent a few days in Lisbon, Portugal, and was struck by the diversity, the ethnic and racial diversity that was easy to see. I am not saying that Portugal is the only country in Europe that is ethnically and religiously, we're going diverse, because these are still majority white countries, but it was the first place I'd visited in Western Europe where I didn't have to look hard to see people who were Black and brown. So that intrigued me. The weather, I was visiting in December, and the weather was cool, cold, but not like so much so that, you know, you didn't want to be outside. So I could deal with the weather. I did a couple quick Googles and learned that they have over more than 300 days of sunshine. And so Portugal, Lisbon to be specific, was added to my list. Why Lisbon specifically? I am a city girl. I live in what I believe is the greatest city in the world, Mexico City, and that is no accident. I love urban spaces. So as I've been country shopping and exploring options for my second residency, I have been looking specifically at major cities because I know who I am. So what were my impressions of Lisbon, Portugal now in 2023? Remembering that my initial visit was in 2016. If you've done any watching of YouTube videos, any reading online, you know that Portugal is hot right now because of their D7 visa and their new digital nomad visa. There are a lot of foreigners, including a significant number of Americans and a significant number of Black Americans who are choosing Portugal. So I knew things would be different because the country is so much more popular now as a move abroad destination than it was when I first visited. So some of the things that I noticed on this visit that were different: there were significantly more English speakers than when I was there in 2016. When I visited before, I felt like virtually no one but like high school kids spoke English. I was surprised at how many times I went into a restaurant and they handed me an English menu. They greeted me in English. They conversed with me in English. And so that makes sense given the influx in popularity, the influx in, foreigners being in the country. So there's a whole lot more English being spoken in Lisbon than there was before. There were a lot more North Americans. Portugal, Lisbon has always been a place that people like to visit as tourists. But I felt like there were more Americans and Canadians than I saw on my previous visit. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's just an observation. The other thing that struck me on this visit was how much Lisbon did not feel, or at least the parts of the city I visited, did not feel like the capital city of a country. Like the vibe I kept getting was, this is a vacation destination. And I was there during May, which is not even really like a big time for tourists. I think the big time is more happening this summer. So I could not shake the feeling that I was in a place where people went on vacation. And I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's the vibe I kept getting. It felt very much like a town and not a city. It didn't have the urbanness that I'm particularly used to. So what brought me to Lisbon this time? Well, part of it was I was already in that part of the world because I attended the 2023 Exodus Summit meetup in Marrakesh. It was fabulous. It was great to get to hang out with nearly 100 Black women in Morocco, even though Morocco is not one of my favorite places. But that's not what this video is about. Portugal, a 1.5 hour flight from Marrakesh. So this was an easy addition to that trip. And I'd always said I wanted to spend more time there. While I was in Lisbon, I had the opportunity to attend the Black in Portugal and Our Black Utopia meetup, which was a good time as well. So that's why I was in Portugal. I had no real firm plans about where I was going to visit other than Lisbon, or what I was going to do, because I just wanted to kind of try the country on. Okay, so how does Lisbon compare to where I live now, Mexico City? First, let's talk about the vibe. When I initially landed in Mexico City, it felt like home immediately. Like there was no doubt, there was no question about whether or not I could live here. In Lisbon, I don't know. I think I had a really hard time putting my finger on the vibe. It did not immediately feel like home. It felt modern, which is interesting to say given how old Lisbon is and given, how old the facades of some of the buildings are. It didn't feel like I was going back in time. I'm trying to think, what other vibes did I feel in Lisbon? The multiculturalness was another thing that I would say even more so than when I was there in 2006. You could definitely feel that, like, hey, there are lots of different kinds of people. Everybody's going about their life together. I don't know how to label that. Okay, so how does the weather compare to here in Mexico City? It was warm there like it was here. Lisbon has a Mediterranean climate, so warm to hot summers, cool, rainy winters. Did it rain? There was one day when there might have been drops, but it was as warm as it is here in Mexico City. April and May are the warmest months of the year in Mexico City. typically. So on weather, I think they kind of compare, although I did realize it was mid 80s while I was there. So it was warm. A lot of Europe doesn't have air conditioning, so I was carrying around my fan. It was getting a lot of use. And one thing I thought about was, if it's this warm in the end of April, beginning of May, what is it going to look like here in July and August? As opposed to Mexico City, where rainy season starts late May into June and temperatures come down. So August in Mexico City is cool and nice. I don't know what it's going to be like in Lisbon. I kept thinking, oh, this is a place that would be very hot in the summer and probably very crowded. So not a place I would want to hang out in the summer. Okay, how did Lisbon compare as far as cost with Mexico City? This is interesting because when you're considering residency, especially if you are not going to have a work visa, you need to provide that or prove that you have the funds to support yourself. And as of right now, it was not this high when I applied for residency in Mexico. As of right now, you need somewhere between like $2,400 to $3,000 of income a month. It's a different number if you apply based on savings, but if you apply on income, it's about that. Compare that to Portugal, where I think the new number is about 705 euros a month. So that, even being generous with the conversion rate, you're talking about somewhere between 700 and 800 USD per month of income to qualify for a residency visa in Portugal. Significantly less than what it is here in Mexico. But I did not find that same disparity reflected in prices. Rent is more expensive there. That's one of the reasons my trip was only about a week and a half. For a week and a half in an Airbnb where I had my own room, but I did have to share the bathroom, I spent about $350 USD. That is half of a month's rent here in Mexico City. Again, or my rent. Short-term rentals are going to be more expensive, but even the people I know who have long-term leases there, the rent is higher than what I would pay for a comparable unit here in Mexico City. So cheaper if you're trying to apply for residency, but rent is more expensive. When it came to food, I did not come across places where I could have a meal for less than $5 in Lisbon. Those places may exist. I just did not see them. In Mexico City, I have quite a few options. And when I say a meal, I'm talking about the food plus something to drink, possibly even a dessert as well. So food was more expensive. Now, was it as expensive as food prices in the US? No. I think you could eat significantly cheaper as long as in Lisbon than you could in the US, as long as you didn't go to places that were geared toward foreigners. For example, on my last full day there, I wanted a hamburger. So I went to this American hamburger place. That was the most expensive hamburger I've ever eaten in my life. I think the hamburger and fries was like $23. But the places like that were the exception. I went to a pizza restaurant and I got a pizza for like one person, and it was like 12 euro, which is more expensive than here, but I think that is less expensive than the US. Other costs, transportation. A subway ride here in Mexico City is 5 pesos, which is the equivalent, it's less than 30 cents USD, somewhere between 25 and 30 cents. A subway ride in Lisbon was €1.65. Unless you got a card and put money on it, then you got them at a discounted rate of €1.47. So transportation costs were higher. I took a Bolt, which is rideshare, similar to Uber. It was a 12-minute ride that was about a little bit over €4, like €4.15. I know, compared to US prices, that seems like a bargain. Compared to Mexican prices, I don't know. So I'm trying to think. I went to the grocery store, Lidl, which is like Aldi. I believe they have the same parent company. The things at Lidl were quite affordable. More so, I guess, well, y'all got to remember, it's not like I'm buying produce, okay? But for the things that I bought, I felt like they were probably on par with what I pay in Mexico City, or maybe a little bit less. But y'all got to remember, I'm not buying fruits and vegetables and ingredients to cook. I was buying convenience foods and pastry items. Speaking of which, y'all know my thing is to check out bakeries. I did go to a bakery that had cruffins, which is a muffin that's made out of like croissant dough. Have them here. It's a place down the street from my house. Here I spend about 40 pesos, which is a little bit more than $2 for a cruffin. In Lisbon, I think the cruffin was like €3. So that gives you some idea on the prices. I think for all of Europe, because remember, back in September, I went to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Portuguese prices beat those prices big time. But if I'm comparing it, like thinking about living the life I have here and living it in Lisbon, it would cost me a little bit more to do it in Lisbon. Here's the big question. Can I see myself living in Portugal, specifically Lisbon, Portugal? Well, Portugal it looks really good on paper. It is a solid option. It's got quite a few things going for it. First of all, if I get residency in Portugal, I would have residency in the EU, and after 5 years, assuming that I can pass the Portuguese language requirement, I could have a Portuguese passport, which is an EU passport, one of the most powerful passports in the world. So it's got that going for it. We've already talked about the requirement in order to qualify for the residency visa. It's got that going for it because there are very few places that you can get residency showing so little income. That 5 years ago, things might have been different. But in the world we live in right now in 2023, there are very few places with such a low barrier to entry. As a Black American, and for the non-Black Americans watching this, you may not understand. But living in a place where there are people who look like you, who are involved in society, who are integrated in society, is significant. Now, am I foolish enough to say, oh, it's a racial utopia there? Absolutely not, because there is no such thing. However, if I'm comparing it to some of the other countries that are on my short list for second residency, they have far fewer Black and brown folks. So that's a check mark for Portugal. In that same vein, something that Portugal has that a lot of other places don't have is a significant number of Black Americans. Now, of the African diaspora, we are not a monolith. My experience as a Black American is very different than that of somebody from the West Indies, from Jamaica, from Barbados, from the UK. But in Lisbon in particular, there are a significant number of Black Americans, so we have a similar culture, we share a similar background. That's not something a lot of places have going for it. So that's another check mark for Portugal. Proximity to travel locations. That's something else Portugal has going for it. I've already mentioned, it was a short flight. If I was further south in Portugal, I could have taken a ferry from Portugal to Africa. So being in Europe, I could easily travel to other European countries. I could travel to the Middle East. I could travel to Africa. So it would be a good location. And after all, I am Picky Girl Travels the World. So travel figures into that as well. And then some of y'all are going to laugh at me for including this. But if I were interested in dating, I am not. But if I were, I think Lisbon offers some options that are not readily available to me in the same way here in Mexico City. So I'll just say this, that when I was out and about, there were men who were taller than me, who appeared, because I ain't talked to none of them, y'all know that, who appeared to have interesting ethnic backgrounds. Not that that's a requirement if I was into dating, but there just seemed to be a whole lot more options versus what I'm seeing here in Mexico. So, those are things that Portugal has going for it. So we've answered the question, could I move to Portugal? Could I live in Lisbon? Yes, I could. But would I want to live there? Oh no. The jury is still out, but the jury is probably leaning toward probably not. Notice I didn't say no, but probably not. So let's talk about why that is the case. The biggest thing that makes Portugal probably a no for me is that with residency, the way they have their set up, I would be required to spend 6 months, a year. It might even be more than that in the beginning, that I have to be there living in Portugal. I don't like being told where I have to be. So that is a negative mark for me. And that's probably the biggest one. The higher cost of living. We've discussed on this channel that although I have achieved FIRE, I did it on a teacher salary. So I'm not rolling in money. So the higher cost of living is a concern for me, as I'm looking at my finances and trying to make sure I got enough money, to last me throughout my retirement. The Portuguese language is another negative mark against Portugal. And it's not their fault per se, but I struggled. I have been in Italy where Italian and Spanish are not the same thing, but I could at least make out words that people were saying. That was not the case with Portuguese. I could read some of it and glean the basic meaning, but the pronunciation was driving me nuts. I am hesitant to put a lot of work into speaking a language that is not spoken in lots of other countries. European Portuguese is technically different than Brazilian Portuguese, but even if you said they were the same, we're talking about those two countries and a few sub-Saharan African countries. I don't know. So Portuguese is another negative mark. The Portuguese people. Okay, so here's the thing about the Portuguese people, and I could be wrong, but they did not seem as welcoming to me as Mexicans are. And it's not all about me, but it's just like walking in the subway or going down the stairs to the subway, or I'm walking up a hill, the stairs up a hill or whatever, people would some people would just bump into me. And I'm not, hey, I know people are in a rush and they got to go where they got to go. But in Mexico, if somebody needed to get past me, they would be saying permiso, or when I sneezed, people would be telling me salud. None of that there. And I didn't realize how much I enjoyed that part of Mexican culture, like the kindness that kind of just permeates the entire culture. I didn't see a similar thing with the Portuguese. And that's not, I'm sure if I had needed help and I had stopped somebody and asked them a question, I am fairly confident that they would have helped me. But me just standing around looking a little confused did not get anyone to help me. And it wasn't a test or anything. It's just something I noticed. And I prefer how people act in Mexico. We can't not talk about the hills in Lisbon. I absolutely hated that. I absolutely hated all the damn hills, all of the stairs. There were several times when I was trying to find a place and it got so bad that on my Google Maps, I turned on the topography screen so that when I put in, give me directions to this place, I could see if there was a change in elevation and how bad it was. Because there were times I was climbing up the hills trying to get somewhere and I was like, maybe I will just call a ride share. I don't know if I could do this. I did not enjoy that. When I lived in Honduras, where I lived was very hilly, and that was one of the reasons I was like, I got to get out of here. So that is a big negative. And I don't know, the city, I was struggling with this before trying to describe the vibe in Lisbon. I'm going to say this, and I'm sure somebody's going to be in the comments with their own comment about it. It did not seem inviting. And by that, I mean, as I walk through the streets of Mexico City, I have this desire to wander and to explore and see what there is to see. I did not get that in Lisbon. And I kind of would like that in a place that I'm going to live. So, for all of that, would I live there? Probably not. I'm not closing the door on Lisbon or on Portugal, because I already know some of y'all are in the comments like, oh girl, but you didn't check out this, you didn't check out that. Maybe on the next trip. But if we're going to talk about where I am right now in the second residency journey, Portugal has definitely come down on the list. So we will see where this goes. I'll be sure to let y'all know the next time I take a trip where I'm trying on a new possibility as I continue to do my country shopping. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you've not subscribed, I don't know what you're waiting for. Go for it. Make sure you turn on notifications. Thank you so much for watching, guys.